It's a crisp November morning in 1965, and a low hum pierces the stillness over a stretch of tall grass deep in the Vietnamese highlands. Everyone on the ground knows that hum. Every soldier who hears it feels a flicker of hope. It's the sound of a helicopter blade slicing the air, a sound that means supplies, reinforcements, maybe a ticket home if you're wounded. Most folks on that ground had no clue who was piloting these helicopters, and yet they would soon owe their very lives to a man who refused to back down under a hail of bullets. That man was Bruce Crandall. If you'd been there, you might have seen him in the pilot's seat, eyes fixed with unwavering resolve, ignoring the deafening cracks of rifle fire and the thick clouds of dust swirling around him. What made his story so remarkable wasn't just that he kept flying back into danger. It was the grit and the beating heart behind those trips. Bruce didn't merely drop supplies and dash away. He hovered in the face of mortal peril to rescue men in need. And as you'll soon discover, that same unwavering sense of responsibility defined nearly every corner of his life. When we talk about Bruce Crandall, we're stepping back into an era of Cold War anxieties and simmering global tensions. Born on February 17, 1933, in the city of Olympia, Washington, Bruce entered a world perched on the brink of worldwide transformations. Back then, America was grappling with the aftershocks of the Great Depression and witnessing the upheavals of World War II. His childhood straddled the final years of that immense conflict and the dawn of a new standoff with the Soviet Union. Olympia itself, framed by evergreen forests and rugged coastline, was a modest but comforting place for a kid to grow up. Bruce's parents were no strangers to hard work. His father was known for his straightforward honesty and his mother for her boundless energy. They instilled in young Bruce a sense of right and wrong that would guide him for the rest of his life. People who knew him in those early years say he had a fearless streak. He loved to ride his bike faster than any other kid on the block, nearly skimming the corners of every sidewalk, and unafraid of the scrapes and bruises that inevitably followed. From a young age, Bruce was keenly drawn to flying, though aviation in the 1930s and 1940s was more the stuff of daring test pilots and barnstormers than a routine career path. His father often pointed out tiny planes overhead, and Bruce would crane his neck, imagining what it must feel like to float above the clouds. Financially speaking, the Crandall household lived modestly, so chasing big dreams required a willingness to push limits and seize any opportunity that came along. Bruce's schooling was standard fare, but he stood out because of a quick mind and a dogged determination that made him a favorite among teachers who recognized his potential. In high school, he poured his energy into sports and mechanical pursuits. He loved tinkering with engines, especially once he discovered the intricacies of basic flight engineering. A neighbor who had served in World War II lent him a few aviation manuals, and Bruce devoured them cover to cover. By the time he was finishing school, he saw a military career as not just a practical step given the uncertain job market, but also an adventure that might put him in a cockpit someday. When Bruce was accepted into the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, in college, there was little doubt in his mind that he would eventually fly. The Korean War had just ended by the time he was completing his early training, and the Army was looking to modernize every facet of its forces, including aviation. Helicopters were increasingly vital to Army operations, and Bruce, enthralled by these machines that could land where fixed-wing aircraft could not, signed on to become a helicopter pilot. Little did he know how central that decision would become to his identity. As the United States edged closer to deeper involvement in Vietnam during the 1960s, it was precisely the Army's helicopter pilots, people like Bruce, who would be called upon to perform some of the most dangerous missions in modern warfare. Before shipping out, Bruce married Arlene Louise, his high school sweetheart. In his letters to Arlene during flight training, he admitted a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Despite the cocky exterior he showed his Army buddies, these private letters revealed someone who understood the serious risks of aviation combat and the impact these dangers could have on a young family. When the war in Vietnam escalated, Bruce's unit deployed to Southeast Asia. No combat scenario can truly be compared to the previous one, but Vietnam introduced entirely new challenges: thick jungles, hidden trails, an elusive enemy familiar with the terrain. Helicopters became the lifeline for ground troops, delivering everything from ammunition and food to medical evacuations. For Bruce, that sense of responsibility he'd learned from his parents, that unshakable moral compass, became his beacon. As a pilot in the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, he quickly earned a reputation for bravery bordering on recklessness. Yet if you asked him about it, he'd wave it off with a grin and say he was just doing his job. Nothing tested that conviction like the Battle of Drang in November 1965. This was one of the earliest large-scale engagements between U.S. forces and the People's Army of Vietnam. The sun baked the high grass, men crouched low, scanning the tree line for sudden bursts of fire. Bruce was at the controls of a UH-1 Huey helicopter. His call sign back then was Ancient Serpent 6, although many would later know him by his nickname, Snake. From above you could see the swirling dust as helicopters tried to land amid incoming mortar and small arms fire. On one trip alone, Bruce's Huey came back riddled with bullet holes. His co-pilot would sometimes glance at him wide-eyed, certain that the battered aircraft wouldn't fly another mile. But Bruce would push on. He performed repeated supply runs, ferrying out wounded men who likely would have died without that immediate evacuation. In total, he flew 22 missions on a single day, continuing even after his own aircraft sustained heavy damage. Those who served alongside him recounted how Bruce showed zero hesitation. He treated these missions as if they were simply the next shift in a never-ending line of responsibilities, not a string of life-or-death gambles. In a quieter moment after the battle, he was observed crouched beside his chopper, hands trembling in exhaustion, sweat dripping down his face. That small moment told the truth. He felt every strain, every brush with disaster, but his sense of duty propelled him back into the cockpit every time. That commitment had been shaped by more than just training and discipline. It was rooted in his personal life. Despite being half a world away, he always kept a photograph of Arlene in the helicopter console, tucked into a side compartment so it wouldn't fly loose in the turbulence. When he managed to write letters, he described the stifling heat and the heartbreak of watching so many wounded men. He confessed to nightmares and a stubborn sense of responsibility to be the one who gets them home. This was personal to him, not just an order from superiors. If you read through some of the diaries and recollections of men from the 1st Cavalry, you'll find genuine awe when they talk about Crandall. One private wrote, "I'd never seen such nerve. He'd land that Huey in the middle of chaos. I swear bullets were dancing off the skids." It was never a self-serving brand of courage. Bruce wasn't known to brag or to scold those who felt fear. He just believed that if you were in a position to save lives, you did it, even if that meant risking your own. That mindset didn't appear overnight. In conversation, Bruce often mentioned the influence of his father, who taught him to finish what you start. So if soldiers on the ground called for help, that request was a thread Bruce simply could not leave hanging. It was the same mindset that guided him through some of the hardest moments in Drang, loading wounded men into his helicopter while red tracers slashed through the tall grass around them. Over time, his role in the Vietnam War extended beyond Drang. He continued to fly in countless other operations, often returning stateside to brief commanding officers on the tactical importance of helicopter mobility. Sometimes, these presentations felt hollow to him because the data on a map didn't capture the terror or courage that lived on the battlefield. Still, he persevered, convinced that helicopters were indispensable to saving soldiers' lives. He watched as younger pilots arrived, and he tried to teach them not just technical flying skills, but also the moral dimension of their job, that every mission carried the weight of human lives. Like many veterans, Bruce's personal life was shaped by a mix of devotion and heartbreak. In the letters that surfaced later, you can sense the tension between pride in his service and the emotional toll it took on family. His children sometimes barely recognized him after a long deployment, and Arlene struggled with the fear that each phone call might bring dire news. When Bruce was home, he carried that intangible heaviness that lingers after you've witnessed violence. Friends recall that although he was warm and humorous in his everyday manner, he had these quiet spells. Sometimes he'd get up in the middle of the night to check on their sleeping children, making sure everyone was safe. Of course, no one escapes a conflict like Vietnam unchanged, and Bruce's transformation was evident in subtle ways. It's said that upon returning from his first major combat tour, he confided to a friend that he felt guilty leaving his men behind. That friend, also a veteran, assured him that it was normal to feel torn. In many ways, Bruce wore that sense of responsibility like a second uniform, even on the home front. He tried hard to be the father who would attend every baseball game and the husband who would remember every anniversary. Yet often duty called again, and he would be shipped out for training or more overseas deployments, each separation straining the family. Over the years, historians have debated the moral complexities of helicopter warfare in Vietnam. Some argue that helicopter pilots embodied a kind of compassion rarely seen in war. They could swoop in to quickly evacuate the wounded and reduce casualties. Others point out that the rapid mobility of helicopters also escalated certain conflicts, allowing troops to be dropped in areas that might otherwise have been left alone. Bruce, for his part, was fully aware of how the technology he championed could be a double-edged sword, but if the Army needed to insert troops to achieve a strategic objective, he believed in doing it swiftly and with minimal losses. His unwavering stance was that if you're going to fight to protect as many lives as possible. Another controversy that occasionally flared involved the broader ethical debates about America's role in Vietnam. Anti-war sentiments ran high in the late 1960s, and returning veterans often faced harsh criticism at home. Though largely shielded from the ugliest manifestations of that criticism, because he was still on active duty, Bruce felt the discomfort when he watched the news or overheard conversations that questioned the entire mission. Years later, he admitted that he understood why some people opposed the war, but he also believed that soldiers fighting it deserved respect for risking their lives. His involvement was not in the realm of grand geopolitical strategies. It was in that personal sphere of responsibility for the men on the ground. Despite the controversies swirling around the war, there was no debating the heroism behind the repeated flights Bruce made. But the Medal of Honor he would eventually receive did not come quickly. In fact, although some recognized his valor in the immediate aftermath of Drang, it took decades before the full scope of his actions was thoroughly reviewed. Bureaucratic hurdles, shifting public sentiment on Vietnam, and the natural inertia of military recognition programs all contributed to the delay. Eventually, however, The Army re-examined the accounts of that ferocious battle, and the facts spoke loudly for themselves. By the time he was officially awarded the Medal of Honor in 2007, Bruce was already in his 70s. Standing there, wearing the medal around his neck, he insisted that he was accepting it on behalf of all the men he served with, especially those who never made it back. When you look at Bruce Crandall's life after the war, you see someone who tried to weave his experiences into a broader legacy. He retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel, but retirement didn't mean riding off into the sunset. He took on roles in public service, including city management, where his strong sense of accountability shone through yet again. That same fatherly, no-nonsense approach that had gotten him through punishing combat missions now helped him keep local government operations smooth and honest. He also spoke at various public events, particularly those focusing on veterans issues, mental health support, and the importance of leadership under stress. Though typically modest, Bruce wasn't entirely averse to public recognition if he felt it could help people remember the sacrifices of Vietnam veterans. He sometimes appeared at ceremonies or special commemorations, always stressing that it was the entire helicopter community, pilots, crew chiefs, door gunners, who made the missions possible. In one particularly touching moment at a veterans gathering, a former infantry soldier who had been wounded during the Battle of Drang approached him in tears. He thanked Bruce for that rescue flight all those years ago. Bruce was equally choked up, saying simply, "I'm just glad we got you out in time." The personal toll of war, of course, leaves scars. His children grew up aware that their father was admired, yet they also saw the nights when he'd wake up restless, haunted by memories of men who never returned. Arlene once described how he'd sometimes gaze quietly at the horizon with a look she'd rarely seen before Vietnam, an expression that blended relief with sadness, like someone who just can't erase the images of what he's witnessed. Over the decades, Bruce became a friend and mentor to many younger veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, encouraging them to seek help and share their burdens rather than bottle them up. From the vantage point of history, Bruce Crandall's story stands out not just because of what he did, but because of how he did it. Helicopter warfare was relatively new then, and the lessons gleaned from those early forays into Vietnam shaped U.S. military strategy for years to come. The success of airmobile operations in the 1st Cavalry set a precedent for how ground troops could be rapidly inserted, supplied, and evacuated. That approach saw echoes in later conflicts, from the Gulf War to operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. If you see modern American and coalition forces swiftly deploying via helicopters to a remote site, you can draw a line straight back to Bruce Crandall and his peers who tested the boundaries of what was possible in the jungles of Vietnam. For someone hearing about him today, Bruce's story goes beyond the mechanics of war. It's a tale of personal conviction, of one man's refusal to abandon people who relied on him. The question isn't just whether he changed the course of a battle, it's whether his actions can still inspire us to look at our own sense of responsibility in a deeper way. Military enthusiasts might fixate on the heroics, but there's a profoundly human element in how Bruce balanced those harrowing missions with a deep longing to be a good husband and father. That duality, being both a fearless pilot and an empathetic family man, resonates even more powerfully today, when soldiers and families still grapple with the reality of deployments. It's worth noting that Bruce's initial reluctance to accept personal accolades underscores a humility that can sometimes be rare in stories of wartime valor. He was proud of the tradition he represented and the men he served alongside, and while he eventually embraced public recognition, like induction into various halls of fame, It was always with that sense of group achievement. He wanted to make sure that each rescue, each supply run, was seen as a team effort. Door gunners, co-pilots, crew chiefs, even the mechanics who patched up bullet-riddled Hueys at the end of each day. In the labyrinth of ethical considerations about the Vietnam War, Bruce stands as a complex figure. On one hand, the war itself became a maelstrom of controversy and painful national reflection. On the other, you have a man who, in the moment, chose to protect the lives of the men around him, irrespective of politics. Some historians point to this distinction to emphasize that individual heroism can exist even within conflicts that remain morally contentious in hindsight. Critics might argue that acts of bravery do not absolve a war's questionable motives, yet even they often concede that the raw courage and humanity displayed by pilots like Bruce Crandall transcends the debate. Looking back, it's impossible to ignore the heartbreaking losses that shaped his life. He mourned comrades who didn't return, and their names lived on in his thoughts. In a reflective letter written years after the war, he mentioned how he would sometimes imagine each of those men stepping off the helicopter, safe and sound. In this simple private admission, you can sense the lingering guilt and sorrow that so many veterans carry. Yet for every life lost, there were many more saved precisely because Bruce and pilots like him chose to defy the odds. That knowledge perhaps offered some consolation, even as the weight of memory never truly lifted. As you consider the arc of Bruce Crandall's journey, his childhood in Olympia, his devotion to family, his daredevil flights in the jungles of Vietnam, and the controversies that swirled around the war, what stands out is his deeply personal commitment to preserving life whenever he had the power to do so. That commitment reached its climax during the Battle of Drang, but it also colored his entire military career and retirement years. He didn't seek to become a legend, yet he became one anyway through quiet example and extraordinary acts. The legacy he leaves isn't confined to the Army or to the annals of military history. It's a lasting call to recognize our shared responsibility, to acknowledge that when someone is in need, we rise to the occasion. From this vantage point, Bruce Crandall's life resonates across generations. His story reminds us that genuine heroism is never just about one person's daring deed. It's a testament to the deep bonds we form, the loyalty we extend to one another, and the unseen battles we all fight to protect what we value most. And, perhaps most profoundly, it shows that in the face of overwhelming fear, a determined heart can make miracles happen, time and time again.